Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us till the end of the day. We have one session left. Our last speaker is Clarissa Anderson. You've probably noticed she has been very active in the chat through all of this, so she is clearly an expert on all things accessibility. So I'm looking forward to her presentation. Clarissa works at the University of Oklahoma. She's the manager for course development for OU Education Services, and she is going to share a how-to session on media. Clarissa, I'll let you take it from there.
Hi, everyone. Give me a second while I share my screen. Okay. All righty. Oh, sure. Okay, so we'll be focusing on specifically to media. We've covered a little bit of the topics here and there throughout the earlier sessions, but we'll go into a bit of a deeper dive. That being said, we do only have about 30 minutes, so there's only so much we can cover in that amount of time. So I will be doing more of a brief overview, and there will be resources provided if you want to have a deeper dive into everything as well. So in terms of what we'll be talking about, more of a detailed discussion about image description, alt text. We brought up it through a few of the presentations earlier on. So what are some best practices for alt text? How do you evaluate whether it's quality or not? We'll talk a little bit about live captioning and transcription. I'll showcase some examples, but won't go very detailed into specific tools because every institution uses something different. And I'd rather be more broadly applicable. And also just some basics about accessible design for media. So some of those concepts we were talking about for web, for documents, those also apply for videos as well. And as I mentioned, there'll be various resources and tools that are linked to at the end of the slides as well. So starting off first with image description. So there's a lot of different purposes that we might have for instructional images, but I'm going to focus on kind of two different types of images. So there's informative images. So think of things that represent concepts, information. It has a purpose. There's a reason why we're including it. So I have an example on the screen that's showcasing Socrates, Plato, Greek philosophy. There's a reason why we might be discussing it. Maybe this is a art history class or something like that. Also, we have decorative images. So those are things that generally are added for aesthetics, or maybe you feel the page is missing something, but it doesn't really have an additional value beyond the aesthetics. So here you might have added, like, let's say you have a class on business and you decided I wanted to add a photo here of people working the various business documents. There's not really anything in particular that these documents are showcasing. Really, they don't have an instructional reason. So in that sense, it would be a decorative image. So in general, here's some ways that you can identify a decorative image. So would you be able to understand the page if you had that image covered up? Does the surrounding text include all that same information? And also, was the image added just to look nice, or does it have that informative purpose? So we talked about this throughout our presentations, but just to recap, why do we need alternative text or alt text? So a lot of the obvious will be assisting a user with a vision impairment, but there's lots of other reasons why we might need alternative text. Potentially, you might have slow internet access. There may be users who have cognitive or learning disabilities, or otherwise just making sure that the content we're making is compatible with various browsers and assistive technology. So some general best practices for alt text. It describes the meaning and context of informative images. So that means we're not going to include alt text for decorative images. That's why it's important to know why are you including an image. So if it is a decorative image, you will mark it as decorative in the settings. Also, alt text needs to be concise, so no more than 125 characters. For example, certain LMSs and screen readers will stop reading if it's past a certain amount of characters. So in that sense, it should be kind of short and sweet and address what is the meat of what students need to know. You also don't really want to put image of, so if you did, it would sound like image of, I don't know, a pineapple or something. So it'd be very repetitive, and you don't want to have the file name because that's not really going to describe what's going on in the image. So here's kind of an example of alt text. We have an image on screen. Let's say we had no detail. You could say, two women smile for camera. That doesn't give me any sense of where they are, what they're doing, what's going on in this image. Then if we add a little bit of detail, but we still don't have any context, you could say, two women display rings on their hands. Why are they doing it? What are these rings? What is going on? So if you add in that detail and context, you could say something like, two women display their new class rings during OU's annual ring ceremony. So now we know what they're doing. We know why they're there. So keep in mind, context matters. So we have an image on the screen where it has various people in a warehouse, there's boxes, there's potentially some sanitizing going on. What might be going on in this image? It really could depend. It could be supply chain issues, it could be talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, could be even just basic as they're keeping inventory. So that's why it's so important to include the purpose and the context of the images in the alt text, because otherwise you don't really know why that image is there. So a few questions to think about when you're creating alt text. Is this instructional? So again, is this a decorative image or not? If it is, then you stop there. What is the purpose and the context of this image? What do I need to include? And what key details are important to understand what's going on, and what sort of information is extraneous. So you may not need to go into detail about like what color clothing everyone's wearing, right? That may not have any particular purpose to what your students need to know. And then once you've created the alt text, here's some general questions to think about. So how long is my alt text? If it's too long, cut it down. You may need to accompany it with some additional caption or description outside of the alt text. Also, is everything necessary? So again, thinking, are there any details that don't add any value? Does it meet my goals? And also, this came up earlier, what makes sense if I couldn't see the image? So here's a really basic example. We use the same questions that I just mentioned. Like, is this an instructional image? What's the purpose, context? What key details? So this actually is alt text from ChatGPT. So it says, Franklin D. Roosevelt sits at a desk signing a document with a fountain pen, surrounded by a group of formally dressed men in suits. An American flag is visible in the background. Now this is all right. So it did say that Roosevelt's in there. That's great. It also said that he's signing a document. We have an action, but it doesn't really have that context. Like, why are they there? What is he signing? And there's all of these other maybe unnecessary details, like he's using a fountain pen and other things like that. So if I were to rewrite this, I might say something like, Franklin D. Roosevelt signs the New Deal with Francis Perkins and members of Congress. So that even also says, who are these people that are with him? So I did mention, in that case, I had asked ChatGPT to kind of help me with alt text. You can use alt text as kind of a starting point. I think it's a little more helpful if you are looking for complex images in comparison to maybe a historical image or a more basic image. So it can be a good starting point, especially if you don't know much about alt text or even much of the context of what's in the particular image. So it can give you kind of a basic description of what's going on. But as we just saw, it's really important to have that human aspect, making sure, is it meeting the goals that I need to? Is it accurate? Is it relevant? And then just making sure that it's quality with whatever we're using. So this was mentioned earlier. when you add images in PowerPoint, it will automatically generate alt text for you. And sometimes it's all right, but sometimes it very much goes wrong. So here's an example of an image that I added into PowerPoint that has various accessibility icons, mentioning things like that accessibility is easy to implement, that we don't want to wait until accommodations are requested before we start. And the automatic alt text that PowerPoint gave me is a group of black and white icons. This will not tell me anything about what is going on in this particular image. So it's really important to know that these are being automatically added to your images and that you want to verify what it is saying. So we've discussed complex images briefly throughout. I will say we don't have enough time to go into all the details about complex images. Adam's linked a really great course from Able Tech that I would recommend checking out. But really briefly, we mentioned alt text is no more than 125 characters. Now, if you had an image like the one on screen talking about billion-dollar disasters by type from 1980 to 2019, this is a very complex image. There's a lot of different things going on, even more so than maybe a normal graph. It would be very hard to describe what's going on in, say, 1 or 2 sentences. So if you have instances like this, you will need alt text, but you will also need to add a description and or caption to really explain what's going on. And I would also recommend, if you have graphs, to include an accompanying data table, so that way students know what the data is. So now we're going to shift a little bit and talk about live captioning and transcription. So why captioning? Why transcription? Beyond general guidelines, it really will benefit a wide variety of people. So it would help an individual with a hearing impairment, but also those with a cognitive or learning disability. As mentioned before, if you're in a very loud environment or even a quiet environment, think of like a library. Individuals who are English language learners, and also just in general can aid with overall attention and comprehension. So live captioning is a feature of a lot of different platforms. I'm going to specifically mention Zoom meetings, but a lot of the various services use kind of AI generated live captioning. I would recommend using this, especially if you have online or hybrid courses or otherwise online meetings. One thing I will note is it needs to be enabled in the meeting settings so that people will be able to use those captions. And it really won't be a substitute for specific accommodations. So keep in mind, it is a good resource, though.
Clarissa, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah.
In the case of a graph or other complex image where the
Mhm.
text description is given elsewhere, can or should you be can or should the text be referenced in the alt text, as in refer to the text description below for an explanation of this graph or something similar?
I think that I would probably at least explain the general concept of what it is, but then I think it's appropriate to say that there'll be further detail outside of the alt text. I think that it's generally what we've done, but for my other experts in the room, you're welcome to correct me on that. But that's what I would kind of recommend. Any other questions before I move on?
That's all in the chat so far.
So we talked about live captioning in PowerPoint earlier. One thing I would say, if you are recording, for example, live Zoom sessions or other team sessions or things like that, I wouldn't really recommend using PowerPoint as well, just because then you might end up with 2 sets of captions, which can be a little confusing if they contradict each other. So I would use this a little more if you have a face-to-face class. That way you can really give that additional layer of accessibility. And I've linked some resources on how to do this. I mentioned before, even beyond Zoom, Microsoft Teams also has live captioning. From what I've heard, it's not quite as good as some of the other like even Zoom's live captioning, but I did want to mention that as a resource since some of our institutions will use it for collaboration. Also wanted to note that if you have any audio only files, whether that is um, just audio or even a video, like a screen recording that, sorry, that's something separate. Let me start again. If you have any audio only files, think of like podcasts, it really will need to be accompanied by a transcript. So that way everyone's able to know what was the content and also to follow along if they need to. Is there any other questions in the chat? I saw some things show up.
Adam and Allie are just agreeing with you, so you gave a great answer.
All right, great. I did want to briefly mention audio description. I won't really go into a lot of detail on this, but really audio description is a feature that can describe what's going on screen in a video. So in this example, they say number 3 on the red team for the soccer team gets control of the ball. So this is something that with like the web content accessibility guidelines, it would need to have it for particular videos. And especially if like a student needed an accommodation, this might be a particular accommodation they may need. This was a really great decision chart that I found from the Section 508 website, which by the way is a great resource as well. So if you have any media that doesn't have sound, so think of like a screen recording you did to show a process like a demo, but you didn't have any sound, you would need either a transcript or audio description explaining here's what you were doing. In general, I would really recommend adding sound to anything like that if you're doing a demo, but if there is anything like that, then it would need some kind of text equivalent. If you're using video and then it doesn't, if you're not using video and it's audio only, then it would be a transcript. So again, thinking like the podcast we were just talking about, that would need a transcript. And then if you are using video and it's got sound, it would need closed captioning and then audio description. So I think I saw some stuff show up in the chat.
Yes, there's a couple of questions. So regarding expanding on alt text, where would you put the additional description? Just as text content on the side, or is there a better way to do it?
It depends on where it is. So I would say if it is like on a Canvas or LMS web page, that one's pretty easy to do in like the surrounding body text. And then I would say like Word documents, that's also pretty easy to do surrounding the image. Um, it's a little bit of a harder question for PowerPoints. I don't necessarily know what the best practice for there would be. So Adam or Allie or anyone else is welcome to jump in for PowerPoints. But generally what I would say is you need to have a text equivalent somewhere. So there have been times you might say, because it's all in the surrounding body text, effectively this image becomes a decorative image. So that to say, surrounding body text can be a really great way to address some of those complex images and or otherwise even things that required like say it was an image of text or a complex graphic and you would have to say surrounding here's kind of what it says in the image. We tend to use at my institution, we have kind of like a code we use for like image long description. And so that's kind of how I would address it depending on how complicated the image is. But for most of the complex images, I would say, you know, putting the description above the image, putting it beneath the image would probably be sufficient.
Thank you. And there's some more discussion in the chat also, but there's another question we'll jump to. Do you have suggestions for shared videos that already have their own captions on the video, but it is not well done? I cannot remove that already exists. So how do I add a better closed caption to the video? What is the best way to maneuver through this type of situation?
Yeah, that would be a complicated situation. I mean, I would first try to see if there's any way that I could like contact whoever made the video and if they could revise it. Otherwise, I would say at least at a minimum, a transcript with accurate information should definitely be included. But I mean, ideally you would get it corrected, or depending on how it is, you may need to pick a different resource. I would hope it didn't come to that point, but it could.
It looks like you're right on the same page as all of the other comments too. So perfect.
Any other questions before I move forward?
I think all the rest of the chat is comments on those, so I think you can
Okay,
go.
great. So in terms of video captioning, so it's kind of a great segue. We've talked a lot about how there's Zoom auto captions and things like that. They are a good starting point. It's a lot quicker to fix something that AI's transcribed than to do it all yourself. But it's not ADA compliant. So it means that it needs to be either edited for accuracy or sent for, say, professional human captioning. And it also needs to include sounds and noises, which, depending on the service you're using, may not have that included, or it may not necessarily be accurate. So again, this might require manual editing. It also might be something that your institution has either staff or funding available. I don't want to make any assumptions about that because every institution is different. But I will say that editing captions is extremely important. It is pretty time consuming if you need to do it manually. Before I move forward, any questions about that?
Out in the chat.
Alrighty. So now we'll go to kind of the last section. In some ways, I think this is kind of a wrap up of items we briefly discussed in other sessions. So here's some kind of best practices for typeface formatting, especially if it's going into a video. So I generally recommend bold if I need to use it for general emphasis. That being said, you can't bold everything because then you can't read anything. So use it sparingly, bold specific words or specific phrases. Generally don't underline if possible, beyond the fact that it is usually associated with hyperlinks. It's also harder to read when things are underlined. And then italics also use sparingly because it is harder to read. That being said, I know underlines, italics, they can be a bit of a sensitive subject sometimes because it might have to do with citations. I would say it's okay to use those for that particular reason. We're talking more general, like when you're emphasizing things to add notes or focus to things. Try to avoid all caps. If you have to use it, kind of keep it only for acronyms where that's what the expectation is for acronyms. Keep high contrast, and also don't make things too small. So it says 12-point font. That's more for documents. Keep in mind you want it to be large enough that it's easy to read. I don't want to give a certain number, just given that if you're using PowerPoint, it's going to be a certain number, but it might be a different size if you're using anything else. But just keep in mind, students might also be viewing your video on a phone or a smaller device, so you don't want to use anything that's really tiny. So some also best practices for graphic design. So we talked a bit earlier about sufficient color contrast. There's various resources online if you want to see more for that, but also there's all those color contrast analyzers. You want to consider things like color blindness and not to use color coding. I would say if you're going to use color for associating certain things, you want to make sure you're using an additional method of emphasis. And regarding accessible text formatting, we just discussed that, but also keep in mind if you combine a whole bunch of things, it's even harder to read. And also, we as humans will seek patterns in things. So if you happen to be using a lot of different types of emphasis, um, students will start asking themselves, okay, so why is this in bold? Why is this one underlined? Why is this a different color? So it can be very distracting from the actual content that you're presenting. And then some other
Okay.
recaps for video.
Wait a
Um,
second.
yes,
Can you ever use all caps for headings and titles?
I would say um, you can. I think it's more acceptable for headings and titles than it would be for body text. That being said, I usually prefer not to. Um, but for video, I think it's more okay. When it is like on a web page or something like that, I would definitely not use all caps just because, you know, if someone's using a screen reader, it might read them all as separate letters too. So it would not be the best. Any other questions?
No, not in the chat anyway.
All right, so related to kind of video production, again, making sure that we have accurate captions and, you know, closed captioning is the preference. Audio description as needed, so especially if there's a student accommodation. And then we also want to make sure we're avoiding flashing or quick moving content. You know, we don't want to cause any seizures for students. And also, if you're having a lot of things move in on screen quickly, it's very hard to focus. So some general things to keep in mind when you're recording videos with accessibility in mind. So it's really helpful to share any associated resources or lecture slides in advance. Make sure that students are able to reference them as needed. Also, describe what you're doing, what's on screen, if you're annotating anything. Also, one thing to note, you know, if it is like a Zoom meeting or something that you're recording, read aloud any of the things that are asked in the chat because that's something that students may not necessarily have a resource to later on. Um, Also, keep in mind background noises and sound quality. You know, you might want to consider using a mic that, you know, works better and keeping it to more of a quieter environment if you're recording, and also speaking reasonably slowly and clearly. I mean, you don't want to speak so slowly that no one can really keep up. Um, and it's also helpful to cut longer videos into smaller chunks, focusing on specific topic areas. And if you are recording a specific video, let's say it's like a lecture video or a module overview video, you might consider using a script or an outline. So that way you can help yourself to kind of keep focused on what's important for the video. So now we're kind of at the end of my main presentation stuff. I just wanted to briefly breeze through the various resources that I have linked. So some basics on accessibility, some on alt text and complex images, a little bit on AI, so pros and cons on that for accessibility and alt text. There are some resources, kind of emerging AI tools for like complex images and STEM. I don't have personal experience with them, but I had heard about these and some various resources on captioning description. Here's a couple of color contrast analyzers. I'm sure you all have plenty that we provided today, but these are a couple that I use. And I have answered some questions here, but I think we have a little bit of time if there's any other questions. I'm happy to address them.
There's a question about a recommended mic. That's not too expensive. And also if anyone else wants to ask, you're welcome to unmute.
Yeah, I will be honest, I don't know at the top of my head. If you want to email me, I'll put my email in the chat and I can ask one of our video editors that I work with if they have any recommendations.
Closed captioning on YouTube would not be compliant, is that correct?
It would depend on if it's accurate or not. Generally, anything that is on YouTube or any other platform would need to be accessible as well. So there's been big stuff with Harvard and MIT, even regarding like YouTube video captions. So they would need to be accurate. So yeah, it can be a concern. I would say too, any of the automatic YouTube captions they would need editing for sure.
Can you reshare the resources slide again?
Yeah. Well, also I'll just note that we'll be sharing them like the slides and the recordings on Monday. So, is there a particular slide though that you'd like me to go to?
The comment in the chat was, could you go through the resources more slowly? We're actually out of time, but you'll be able to see those in what we send out. So, thank you so much, Clarissa. That was very, very informative, excellent information. Great presentation.
Thank you. And again, if there's any further questions, people are welcome to reach out to me.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. I've put the link to the assessment in the chat. I'll put it in there one more time. You can go ahead and click that now, but I will also be sending that in the email that goes out on Monday with the recordings and the resources that were shared in all of the sessions. The assessment will be open through the next month, so you have a little bit of time, but while it's fresh on your mind, I would recommend getting that knocked out right away. If you have any questions, let us know, and I'll make sure that you have all the information as soon as possible. Thank you, Clarissa, and thank you everybody who presented today. You were all wonderful.